de Longchamps. I'm the CEO and founder of Inspired Leadership. Leading in times of disruption is incredibly challenging, with 2 out of 3 business leaders expecting that the pace of technology disruption will accelerate even faster in the second half of 2025. The average lifespan of companies has dramatically declined, from 30 to 35 years in the late 1970s to a forecasted 15 to 20 years this decade. McKinsey even predicted that by 2027, 75% of companies currently on the S&P 500 will have disappeared. Technology is the driver of this accelerated change. When we see the adoption of technology, the tablet computer went from nearly 0% adoption to 50% adoption in just 5 years, compared to the telephone 100 years before, which took 100 years to reach widespread adoption. Modern technologies are just doing that in a fraction of the time, with the internet reaching 50% adoption in just 15 years. And I'm sure as we think about AI, the adoption and integration of AI into mainstream is an even faster change that we're all experiencing. Another big startling fact is that 90% of the world's data was generated within just the past 2 years. So the wind of change is blowing faster and harder, and it's not stopping. In fact, change is accelerating at an unprecedented rate. It is no longer a temporary disruption, it is here to stay. So waiting for things to stabilize is just not an option. So our job then as human beings is, in order to become more adaptable and resilient than ever before, requires us to make some changes. The images that you see now are from the Sea Point Promenade in Cape Town, an extremely windy place. And the images are a great example of adaptability. These trees are still growing and thriving, they're just doing it at a different angle. And that's our job as human beings, to be thinking that if the wind is not going to change, how do we adapt? I really love the idea of a wind turbine. Now, wind turbines are specifically designed to take advantage of wind, and they actually spin relatively slowly. And there is a lesson there. They spin slowly to prevent structural damage from centrifugal forces, to reduce noise, to protect the wildlife, like the birds and the bats and the bees, and they spin slowly to avoid excessively high speed at the tip of those wings, which could lead to mechanical failure or structural fatigue. So how do we build resilience for today's windy world in order to prevent mechanical failure or structural fatigue? There are 2 ways to foster resilience, both 100% in our control. The physical side of what we do and how we behave, and the cognitive side, our brains and how we think. In this talk and in this webinar, I want to focus on the cognitive side. The first thing that we can do is to realize which event we're in. Now, sprints are characterized by a burst of speed, elevated and focused energy for a short time, and smiling in relief when it's over. If you're like Sambini, you make the whole thing look pretty easy. It might be something like implementing a new system or adopting a new policy, integrating a new business unit. There is a beginning, there's a middle, and then there is an end. Each one, particularly if they're well managed, is a sprint. Clear beginning, messy middle, ultimate end. But we're not in a sprint. We need to be thinking less of a sprint and more like a marathon, but not a Gare d'Estaing marathon, because she makes it look like a sprint, so more like the Comrades Marathon, where we're running for 11 to 12 hours in the middle of the pack, going for a Vic Clapham medal. And most of the time it's just a slow, steady slog. So we're here to talk about how change isn't a sprint with an end line, but more of an endurance game. And just like any endurance game, we need to build the right muscles, we need to have a strategy, we need to find our own pace in order to thrive. We need to find our people to run with, and we need to constantly be conscious of avoiding mechanical fatigue or structural failure. So let's explore what we mean by building the right mindset. And the first thing that we have to do is to mind the gap. And the gap in this instance is disappointment. Disappointment is the gap that exists between expectation and reality. For years, we've implicitly expected stability, that after the change project, things will settle down. That expectation is now our biggest source of fatigue. The first step to building endurance is to accept that the terrain that we're in is one of constant change. So don't fall victim to expecting things to go back to normal. Because when our expectations are constantly under threat and we feel disappointed, when we expect calm and we expect things to settle down, our brains then perceive this constant, unpredictable, the disruption, the new changes. Our amygdala goes into overdrive. And that triggers the fight, flight, or freeze response, which is a huge contributor to making us feel anxious, overwhelmed, resistant, and exhausted. And I've heard so many people over the last few years complain relentlessly of how exhausted they are. And yet they're not doing anything that means that they should be physically exhausted, but they're mentally exhausted. And if that is you, you might be experiencing change fatigue, where our brains are living in the gap, acting as if we're constantly under threat, even when we're not. That might be you. You might be sitting here going, I feel anxious, I feel overwhelmed. Maybe I'm living in the gap. So let's think about some of the things that might be, something I experienced. I recently moved from Johannesburg, which is I would say almost a steady climate. Certainly doesn't have a lot of wind. And I moved to Cape Town, which is characterized by a lot of wind. I'd avoided anything with wind because I've got very sensitive ears and I keep getting sick because of wind when I lived in Joburg. But when I chose to move to Cape Town, this is now a choice that I made. I didn't feel like I had to go. There was no one saying I must attend or participate, or it was the only job I could find. There was definitely choice. But when I got to Cape Town, surprise, surprise, there was a lot of wind. And I realized this is a huge shock to everybody, but it certainly wasn't a shock to me because I expected it. And one of the things that I did to adapt to the wind was I cut my hair. I cut my hair off because every time I walked on the beach, which I wanted to do, every time I went outside and it was windy, I just got covered in hair, in my mouth and little bits flying out of a ponytail, all of that stuff, which I'm sure some of the women in the room will identify with. Men who are bald don't have this issue to worry about, but it is an adaptation to make in order to adjust to different expectations. So my challenge to all of you who are listening today is to think about what are those expectations that you might need to adjust. And as you normalize things that are different, normalize the change, then you release your brain and you remove the additional burden of feeling like something's wrong or fighting against something that you cannot change. So adjusting that expectation is a very easy and sensible way, easy to some extent, but honestly it's just interrogating your thinking about the environment you find yourself in and taking control over that. Fortunately, our brains are rewirable. There is this thing called neuroplasticity, and that means our brains can change. We've seen this before. We've got a friend who had a significant stroke. She was much younger. She was like 35 or 40. Really not the age you'd think of a stroke. And that's when it massively affects your brain. And some of your brain dies. And so over the last few years, she has had to rewire her brain. And going from paralyzed in a bed back to riding a bicycle is a fantastic example of how you can teach your brain different patterns in order to thrive in a different context. She's had to do some significant adjustments to her expectations of what her body can do. And sure, that is absolutely tough, but she is back on a bicycle. Maybe not as good as she was, but she's certainly there. So when we can rewire those brains, we can also take ownership for our thoughts. We can actually rewire and create new pathways in our brains, making it easier over time to choose more constructive thoughts in response to stress and change. So our prefrontal cortex, the most recent part of our brain to develop, the part of our brain that really separates us from other living organisms and creatures, things like animals, our ability to think and plan and take ownership for our own existence lives in our prefrontal cortex. That's where our decision making is done. So one of the ways I want to encourage you to start taking greater degrees of ownership through the change is through what we call the thoughts, emotions, and actions tool to help you navigate. So I'll give you an example. Thoughts, emotions, and actions, it fortunately spells tea, so I'm inviting you to have a drop of tea. And what this process helps us to realize is that we are not victims of our emotions. You might feel overwhelmed and think that, wow, I feel so overwhelmed, I'm so anxious all the time. And you start talking or really almost catering to those emotions. What I want to introduce you to, possibly for the first time, and maybe not, is that emotions don't live in a vacuum. You don't spontaneously experience emotions. This might be news to people. You don't spontaneously experience emotions. There is a nanosecond between a triggering event and an experience of emotions in which you are doing a thought. You are thinking something about the situation that triggers an emotion, which very often leads to an action. Okay, I'll give you an example. So you will have a triggering situation. Here I've got some examples. So you might have a triggering experience. So, for example, the Cape Town wind. So the wind of Cape Town is blowing wildly. I might then feel irritated and unsettled because of this wind. But there is a thought that precedes that emotional response. And the thought is likely something like, this wind is awful. Why can't it just stop? I can't enjoy anything. I'm eating my hair. Those are the thoughts triggering this emotion of irritation or frustration or avoidance of going to the beach. There's some sort of emotion, and the action is probably avoiding going to the beach. So there is a triggering situation like the wind, thoughts about it, even though it's quick. That emotion of dread or irritation, the action is I probably avoid going to the beach. And when you apply the thoughts, emotions, and actions in a more constructive way, and you realize that you have control over your thoughts, and you can tap into that emotion to help you with information. Wow, I'm feeling so irritated by this wind. Hang on, wind is still the same. So the triggering situation is still the same. The wind, you can't change it. So the wind is still the same. I realize I'm irritated, and I jump in and I grab my thought and I reframe that thought. So that reframe might sound something like, well, the wind is just part of living here. It's powerful, but it also clears the air. We need the wind in order to avoid that red stuff in the sea. We need enough wind for that. And I can choose how I respond to this wind. I'm telling myself this. I'm grabbing those thoughts. I'm deciding which thoughts I will allow to live in my head. And that influences different emotions. Maybe that emotion is then peaceful resignation. Wind is what it is. It might actually trigger an action like, I think I should cut my hair. It'll help me in the wind. Different things. So I really want to encourage you to tap into your thinking about the situations you find yourself in. It might be as simple as a meeting that goes awry, or it could be just everyday things. Everyday things will be triggering emotional responses in you. And to stop and think, what is that thinking? What am I thinking about the situation that is triggering that emotion? Because it is that emotion that is powering an action. And usually that action is either a reaction or a thoughtful response. We often use that language. If you react to a situation, you have not taken control of your thoughts and emotions in order to be thoughtful and choose a response. So one of those mindsets that is often one that we would absolutely encourage people to jump forward is a growth mindset. You may have heard about a fixed and a growth mindset before, but the growth mindset is very much around the language you will use to talk to yourself. In that thinking, emotions, and actions process, when you have an emotion that feels unsettled, tap into your thinking and ask myself, am I talking to myself with a fixed mindset or with a growth mindset? Where the growth mindset is talking about, oh, this is challenging, but I can learn to navigate it. Or what opportunity does this change present for me? Or setbacks like this are opportunities for me to grow. What can I learn from it? So a growth mindset and the language of the growth mindset, we want to foster and encourage and learn it like a second language inside our heads so that we are more equipped to face the world that is constantly changing because we've adjusted our expectations and we've changed how we think about the world and what's happening in order to foster more constructive emotions. And this is what we call self-leadership. Self-leadership is the practice of intentionally influencing your thinking, your feelings, and your actions towards your objectives. It isn't about ignoring difficult situations. It's about choosing where to focus your mental energy and building this discipline to challenge unhelpful thinking. It's about recognizing the wind is blowing and asking, how best can I navigate this wind? And your brain is literally wired to help you do that. Even with tools like thinking, emotions, and actions, sustained endurance needs powerful fuel. And that fuel is purpose. So when we connect our daily work to meaningful, deeper constructs, it doesn't just feel good, it ignites our brain's natural motivation systems. Our brains actually are hardwired for motivation through the dopamine reward system. When your brain releases dopamine, it's literally saying, this is good, do it again, do it again. So when we connect our actions to a clear purpose or achieve goals that align with our values, our brain releases dopamine. Do it again, do it again. And that gives us a feeling of pleasure and encourages us to do those behaviors again. And that is crucial for sustained motivation as you build that endurance muscle. So think about yourself and the work that you're doing. Are you connecting to the purpose that this work exists? So, as an example, at Inspired Leadership, our purpose is we really believe that better leaders make better people, and better people make better spouses, better parents, better community members. And even though we're not changing the entire world, we might change the world for that one person, that one family. And through that, we have an impact. And sure, there might be difficult times. Sure, there might be moments where you're struggling with, why doesn't the CRM work? And, why can't I figure out all this technology? And, why is this relationship so hard? There are moments of that. But as you navigate through them, as I navigate through them, it is because I feel committed to the purpose of what we're doing. And that creates that endurance. We've been working at Inspired Leadership for 5 years, and we've grown steadily. It is organic growth. But as the founder, I sometimes feel super frustrated that we're not growing faster and able to share what we're doing with the world at large, because I believe it so strongly. But it is that purpose that fuels the relentless drive and the pursuit of bringing what we do to the world. Sometimes, as human beings, we chase cheap dopamine. And that can be through binge watching and junk food and social media scrolling. And you do get a dopamine hit, which is why these things are quite addictive, is because you're getting a cheap dopamine hit. But when we're talking about building the kind of endurance muscles that we need to navigate through a world that is constantly changing, in other words, we're trying to find purpose through this, so I'm not saying don't have cheap dopamine, but also realize that you're needing to tap into a deeper source of dopamine for real endurance. Now, somebody who really knows what the power of purpose impacts and how it impacts us is Viktor Frankl. Some of you may have heard of Viktor Frankl before, and he was a psychiatrist who survived the concentration camps. in Germany and during World War II. And he authored a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And he asserted in this book that meaning can be found even in the most extreme suffering, because it is the last of the human freedoms, and that is the power to choose one's attitude in any given circumstances. The last of the human freedoms is the ability to choose one's attitude toward any given circumstance. Those are powerful, powerful words coming from somebody who was experiencing some pretty dramatic trauma and survived because of that choice. There was a German philosopher called Friedrich Nietzsche who was born in 1844, so probably not a major figure in the wars, but he says we have the opportunity to engage in this meaning-making process because if you have a why to live for, you can bear almost any how. So a reason, a why, a purpose, something that you're striving towards. And it's not a specific goal like finishing a race, but it is a why. So as an example of a purpose, one might think of somebody who is really clearly connected to wanting to be healthy and well so that they can be there when their children have children, to be an active grandparent. That's quite a compelling reason to stay fit and healthy. And you see that's the person who's really doing well-being practices, not because it's something that we have to do, but because they feel like they want to do it. They want to do it because their why is strong. You've seen people who make radical diets because they want to look good in their wedding photos. Their why is pretty clear. They want to look good in wedding photos that you will look at for the rest of your life. That's a pretty compelling why. So he who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. There's this concept called post-traumatic growth. This highlights how individuals can experience positive psychological change and growth as a result of struggling with highly challenging life circumstances. This growth often involves new ways of thinking, new ways of feeling and behaving, and can be seen in changes in self-perception, relationships, philosophy of life. So just as individuals can grow after trauma, we as people who are living through trauma, we can find growth and thrive amongst the flux of our professional lives by actively seeking meaning. Our third muscle to build is the meaning-making muscle. So I'm sure some of you will have heard the story of JFK's supposed visit to NASA in the 1960s. So when President John F. Kennedy, the American president, went to the NASA building where they were busy launching or building, they were building the muscles, they were building the spacecraft to land on the moon. There is a story that accounts that during that visit to NASA, he encountered a janitor who was cleaning the floors. And Kennedy, who was well known for his ability to connect with people, supposedly asked the janitor what he was doing. And the janitor, without hesitation and with a real sense of pride, said, "Mr. President, I'm helping put a man on the moon." And that's a powerful example of how everybody's work connects to the purpose of the organization that you are serving in at the moment. Remember that you are working in the organization that you're in out of choice. You are choosing to be employed by that organization. You could choose another organization if they'd have you, or you could choose to start your own business, or you could choose unemployment. These are all choices. Don't think for a moment that you are a victim of the organization that you're in. You have choices, and today you're choosing to work for that company in that situation. When we think about purpose and meaning, it's super useful and powerful to connect what you do on a daily basis to a larger and more impactful meaning and purpose. I remember one of my many trips overseas, I came back through to the Johannesburg International Airport, and just after border control, there is a little toilet on the left. So I would duck through border control, and I popped into the bathroom, and it was sparkling clean, but sparkling, and nothing on the floor. Everything was just pristine, and the cleaner was there. And so I went to her and I said, "Wow, you've done a really great job of cleaning this bathroom." And she was like, "Thank you, ma'am." And I said, "I don't know if you realize this, but you give tourists the very first impression of South Africa. You are part of the public relations department of South Africa. It's actually not the wildlife. They've got to get through a lot of different places before they get to wildlife. You are giving them the first impression. You're part of the PR and marketing department of South Africa." She really stood up tall and was like, "Wow, thank you so much." She was super grateful for those words of encouragement, but it wasn't really that profound. It was just stating what actually is pretty obvious. So how can you connect the work of your teams to the overall purpose? Or if you're looking at your manager and they're not doing it for you, do it yourself. Take ownership to understand how what you do connects to the broader purpose of your team and your team into the organization. Another great way of connecting your work is to get to the dopamine endurance muscles, is to connect the work that you do to your values and your core values. And it's these core values that create stability during times of external uncertainty. Your core values. Now there's a great story of a lighthouse or a group of lighthouse keepers in a period called the Great Storm. And this might be made up, I don't know, but it really does resonate with core values. In the times gone by when lighthouses were manually managed and there'd be teams and they'd have to keep lights burning and do all sorts of things inside these lighthouses. There was a particular lighthouse on a craggy coastline, and during one of the darkest and wildest storms, the lighthouse tenders were not just performing a job, they were embodying a deep sense of purpose, which was about saving lives. They had core values like stewardship, that sense of responsibility, and vigilance, unwavering vigilance for others. So the storm raged for days on end, and this small group of lighthouse keepers were rotating through, doing their job, just knowing for sure that they were doing something that mattered, that saved lives, and regardless of how they felt, regardless of how tired they were, how much despair they felt, how hungry they got, they kept doing their job because they knew if they didn't, they would be at odds with their own values of stewardship and responsibility and the safety of others. So they weren't waiting around for other people to tell them what a great job they were doing. They weren't waiting for the external world to validate their jobs. They were doing quiet, solitary work by themselves amidst great turmoil, and they drew strength from a deep-seated conviction that their labor was important and what they did aligned to their values. So in this podcast, I'm hoping that you have heard the main messages of how do we thrive in a world that is constantly changing, that is unbelievably complex and challenging to navigate. We do that by realizing the event that we're in, that this is about endurance, that things are not going to change back to the way they were. So your first tool is to mind the gap, adjust those expectations, close the gap, and realize that this is the way the world is now. Let me not expect things to change back. It's not. To challenge your thinking, to get in touch with the voices in your head that are either fixed mindset or growth mindset, and challenge yourself to think differently about the reality of the situation that isn't going to change, but how you respond to it is 100% in your control. And then to find purpose and work that aligns with your values. Finding purpose in the work that you do, realizing that there's a powerful why behind what you do, and uncovering that why. Blind obedience to just doing random jobs isn't very helpful. It's around challenging yourself to find the why, or asking constructively, what is the impact of this work? Or how does what I do fit into the broader picture? Or this deadline, what is it? Where does it go from here? Seeing that what you do connects into a broader picture can make all the difference. So, when you can't change the direction of the wind, or the extent, or the amount of power in the wind, or how long it goes for, or which direction it comes in, adjust your sails. That's in your control. I hope you found value in different thinking about how to navigate through times of complexity, uncertainty, and volatility.